Shabbat Shalom,
Shabbat Shalom.
and welcome. Good morning, good Shabbos, Chodesh Tov. It's also Rosh Chodesh ER this morning. We're so delighted that you are here learning with us. So let's begin by thanking God for the gift of learning Torah together. Page 63. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'harevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu b'fi amcha beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu v'tzetzaenu v'tzetzei amcha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai hamelamed Torah la'amo Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. So, again, Shabbat Shalom, and good morning, Elias and Michelle and Elisa and Dan. So Joel is our second prophet, and Joel is. I have a couple of meta questions about Joel. We don't really know when he did his thing, and if you read the commentary that was attached in your handout. He kind of floats. They don't exactly know when he did his preaching. He's famous for his treatment of locust infestation. And so I have a couple of big meta questions for him. One is, what is it about his treatment of locusts, locust infestation, that is so powerful that it merits his being canonized in the Tanakh, right? I mean, there's been a lot of writers in the world, a lot of ancient writers in the world, but somebody, somehow, some council of wise rabbis and canonizers, when they read all the ancient words out there, they said, oh my God, this Joel guy, this thing about locusts, oh my God, this is so powerful. What was it that was so powerful about his message at the time about locusts? We don't know when, we don't know where, we don't know, but something timeless, urgent, pulsating, vibrant, resonant about locusts. Why at the time was he canonized? And of course, the question is, what is Joel's message to us during COVID-19? His infestation is very visible. Our infestation is invisible, very visible, invisible, and yet there's a lot in common. So I want to begin. So those are the two meta questions. Why was he so powerful at the time, and what's his message to us now? I want to begin just, unlike any other teasers I've ever sent out over 23 years, I sent out 5 links that will gross you out, that are scary and disgusting and
Beautiful.
Yuck.
Those were beautiful.
The locust infestations, because locusts are not just a biblical thing, but they're in 2020 in Africa today. So I'm going to start by asking my colleagues, as you saw those links about contemporary locust infestation in 2020, what did it make you think? What did it make you feel? Elias, your hand is always up.
Yes. So I want to begin with a different note today. So Wes, you for me, I've been here 13 years, and you've been always an inspiration. So there are countless of times where you have done, most of the time, you do great sermons and your words are always inspiring. But I never thought you would become, to me, a fashion icon. So I want to show everybody that my socks today are only trying to imitate
Thank you.
my colleague, an inspiration, the fashion icon,
Yes.
Rabbi Garden Schwartz.
And just so that the congregation knows, today I'm going to be chanting the prayer for the state of Israel.
Anyways, so one of the things that you know, because we've been discussing this, is that just to give you a little perspective of history, there was a huge migration to Argentina from Eastern Europe at the same time that they were coming to America. About 300,000 Jewish people from Eastern Europe went down to Argentina, and they were placed in an area of Argentina that was nothing, absolutely nothing, no cities, nothing. So they had to start from scratch. and most of them became farmers, agricultural, and so on my mom's side, that was the case. And I always grew up, not in the farms, obviously I grew up in Buenos Aires, huge city. I always grew up with my mom telling me about her experiences when she was a child about the locust. There was huge plague in the 40s and 50s in the area where she lived and the state where she lived. And she has these memories of all of a sudden, mostly in summer, playing outside with her siblings and friends. And then all of a sudden, they will see and hear two things. One, the sky will turn dark, very dark, all of a sudden. And there will be like a noise, like a buzzing noise. And they knew that there were the locusts coming. So most of them, the kids, usually I spoke with her last night because I needed to hear from her again. The kids will run into the houses and cover themselves and try to be as protected as possible. And the adults will start running around all the fields trying to protect stuff because they knew that it was it. And then, the next morning they will wake up, absolutely everything gone. Absolutely gone. Like the work of a whole year gone. And she has these vivid, images. And to be honest with you, I utilizing one of your most famous phrases during sermons, whoosh. That will be whoosh to me. She would always talk to me as a child about the locust, and I said, it's my mom's story. And, I don't live there anymore. But now I read this, and I saw the videos, and I said, oh my God, I finally get what my mom was talking about.
Right.
So just to summarize, and to make it short.
Well, it's too long for that. Too late for that.
So, but I'm topping you with socks.
Yes.
Anyways, so to me, the book of Joel or Joel speaks about something that is real.
Yeah.
Many of these prophets speak about something that we perhaps cannot relate that well. This is something that we can really relate.
So thank you very much, Elias, and it was great to see your mom on your phone last night after services.
Thank you to Alisa.
And give her our love. And so this happened to your mom's life in her age. I also, I wanted to share something that comes from Veronica Leifer, who was, good morning, Veronica. It's probably the earliest you've ever been up for a Saturday morning common class. And Alan and Marcia and everyone. Veronica was in Kenya studying, and she personally experienced, experienced personally a locust plague. And she writes as follows, and she said that I could share this with you. If you look down, you could see the speed at which they flew, and the sheer vastness of their numbers, by the shadows quickly moving below your feet. Everywhere you looked, everything was covered yellow. Where you would expect to see green leaves, they were yellow. Only upon closer inspection could you tell that it was hundreds of locusts covering the surface of the leaves and the branches, giving the illusion of a northeastern fall. They were on the earth beneath your feet and would hop away as the threatening presence of a person approached. Everyone started running towards them and watching them fly away in fear. My professor was stuffing her pockets with them to take them back to the lab to analyze their DNA. Some local Kenyan researchers who had joined us to see them started stepping on them, trying to kill as many as they could in an attempt to protect their families and country with this small act. Though when you looked at one locust at a time, they were easily destroyed. It was the collectivity presence of them that was unstoppable. Even when we drove away, the ones that had been caught and stored in the glove compartment somehow escaped and started shooting out at us out of the air conditioning vents. They seemed inescapable. For the time we were there, I was in awe. To see something so shocking, vast, was almost incomprehensible. And that was in February of 2020. Thank you, Veronica. So here's what I want to do. I want to just outline for you Joel, and again, my two questions: what's so powerful about what he says, and what's his message to us today? So, and I want to invite everyone here we're going to do a little bit of a textual dive. If you take a look at Joel, there's some very interesting infrastructure to it. First of all, the prophecy about locusts begins and ends with multi-generational stuff. So if you look on page 1 of the handout, verse 2. Listen to this, O elders, give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has the like of this happened in your days, or in the days of your fathers? Tell your children about it, and let your children tell theirs, and their children the next generation. That is exactly what just happened. Elias's mom told him, and Elias tells his kids and tells all of us, right? This is just unbelievable. And then what the cutter has left, the locust has devoured. What the locust has left, the grub has devoured. What the grub has left, the hopper has devoured. There's 4 different kinds of locusts, and if you saw the links, some start crawling on the ground. They eat everything in sight, and after a number of weeks, they get enough energy that they can start flying and really terrifying and terrorizing people and communities. So it starts with multi-generational. At the end, look on page 7 of the handout, chapter 3. So it begins with generations saying, oh my God, locusts, oh my God, I never saw anything like it. And at the end, chapter 3, after that is to say, it's going to end with a healing, and all the damage wrought by the locusts is going to be healed and recompensed and restored. After that, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see vision. And Elias picked out the Debbie Friedman song with which we're going to conclude today based on that. So it begins with multi-generational nightmare, and it ends with a multi-generational dream. Now, 2 other things just so we appreciate the structure of this. If you look on page 3, chapter 2, verse 1, you see Tiku shofar b'Tzion, blow a horn in Zion. And so this first horn is, oh my God, the locust, and it's terrible, and it's horrible, and it's destruction. And then if you look on page 5, verse 15, a second Tiku shofar b'Tzion, blow another horn in Zion. The first one is, oh my God, this is terrible, this is horrible. It's a horn that you blow for lament and shock and awe. And the second one is Tiku shofar b'Tzion, blow a horn in Zion to solemnize a fast and an assembly, and the people are going to start thinking about what is a response to locust infestation. So we'll get to that. So the chapters here are united by, it begins with a multi-generational nightmare, ends with a multi-generational dream. There's 2 Tiku shofar b'Tzions, one a lament and an alarm, and the second a goad to action. Now here's what I want to do, as a way of stimulating your voices. I want to read some chapters, some verses here, and ask you both to do a split-screen TV. What does it say about the time based on Veronica's testimony and Elias's testimony? And what about when you wake up in the morning in COVID-19 and you listen to NPR and you hear contemporary stories, okay? So I'm going to read this to you and ask you what it makes you think, okay? I'm on page 2 of the handout. This is chapter 1, verse 10. The country is ravaged. The ground must mourn, for the new grain is ravaged. The new wine is dried up. The new oil has failed. Farmers are dismayed. Vine dressers wail over wheat and barley, for the crops of the field are lost. The vine has dried up. The fig tree withers. Pomegranates, palm, and apple. All the trees of the field are sere, and joy has dried up among men. And then look at verse 16. For food is cut off before our very eyes, and joy and gladness from the house of our God. What does that make you think? What does that make you feel? Eliza Berger.
How does it make me feel? Desperate and grief-stricken. Like that I can imagine what it would be for everyone to just see their whole livelihood going up in smoke. I mean, we're seeing that now for so many people, and the part that feels so challenged in this period. There's no stimulus package. There's no agency you can apply to help for. There's no food banks. There's nothing.
Right.
So it's gone, and there's no safety net, and there's no hope of safety net, and there's no time.
Right. You just wake up and all your crops are gone. Your livelihood is gone. Your food supply is gone.
No seeds. You don't have, your crops were also probably the way that you got seeds for the next year. You probably don't have enough in store because you probably planted them all. It's a multi-year problem.
Desperation. Dan, how does it make you feel? What does it make you think?
Yeah, so this particular text, it makes you feel hopeless, right? And then if you want to paint the picture of someone who, say, for instance, is a religious person, then they're going to say, where is God? You know,
Right.
where is God? Is this, everything has disappeared. What am I supposed to do now?
Right.
Yeah. Can we address the other questions or just these?
Yes, of course. What other questions?
Okay. Well, because you talked about why Yoel was chosen.
Yes.
I was thinking about that. So I think it's pretty evident why he was chosen. And if you look at the general structure of prophecy and prophets in Jewish tradition, where the message is that the wrath of God will appear when you have moved away from obeying God's mitzvot. That's really the message of the prophets. I'm not saying that I agree or disagree, but when you move away from it, then it's like, and God's wrath can be like an invading army, as though it is like locusts.
Right.
Which Joel actually mentions. He says, that God is really like the in this text, he's the commander in chief of these
Right.
army of locusts. So I think that but so the message is when you move away from God and the mitzvot, then there are dire consequences. On the other hand, when again in the text, when you return to God, when the right things are done, then hope comes back, and then we can come back. So I think that's the general structure of Yoel is that from the point of view of what's the general structure of
Right.
prophets in Israel. And the one thing that struck me about Yoel, more than a lot of prophets, is that if you read the Hebrew, it's gorgeous. The reading, the flow of it is so beautiful.
Right.
It's just so beautiful. So just when you read it out loud, it's just
He was definitely a prophet.
Beautiful poetry. Yeah. So I want to talk about your the theology of your comment. Joel does a move that other prophets do as well, which I think is deeply problematic for us today. If you look on page 4, verse 11, so all of this destruction and the desperation to which it gives rise, that Elisa talked about, that Elias talked about, that Veronica talked about, where does it come from? Well, these locusts are God's army. Verse 11, and the Lord roars aloud at the head of his army, for vast indeed is his host, numberless are those that do his bidding, for great is the day of the Lord. Then most terrible, who can endure it? Yet even now, says the Lord, turn back to me with all your hearts, and with fasting, weeping, and lamenting. The critical verse in all of Joel, rend your hearts rather than your garments, and turn back to the Lord your God. Now, I want to separate some stuff out here. So it is a biblical, other prophets also say, the Babylonian army, they're God's tool. The Assyrian army, they're God's tool. The locusts, they're God's tool, right? And that is what my late Jewish philosophy professor Neil Gilman would call a broken myth, where you take the biggest enemy of the Jewish people and say that was God's tool, because of course, it was Yom HaShoah this week. You would say, oh, the Nazis are God's tool. God forbid. That's a broken myth, right? So we don't do that. We reject that categorically, and if we reject it for the Nazis, we have to reject it for the locusts, for the Assyrians, for the Babylonians. So that's a piece of prophetic theology that I would say is abhorrent and appalling to us, given modern Jewish history, right? However, can you separate out that from verse 13, rend your hearts rather than your garments, and turn back to the Lord your God? In other words, is there some way, and I think this is the key piece of Joel, and what's key to the rebirth, is that the community does a soul searching. And they say, what are we going to learn from this?
Right.
And how can we change up our conduct so that we can have a different outcome? Without the horrendous theology that God loves locusts and Nazis and Assyrians and Babylonians, right? We're going to reject that. But can we take the rend your heart, not your garment, and think, how can we better our game? Michelle, what's your reaction to all of this?
So, you and I had a conversation earlier this week on just a horrible morning about the God of the Tanakh being a God that is cruel and callous. And the theology that you're articulating is just profoundly, profoundly troubling. And to the modern ear is just impossible to accept. And yet, it is actually our biblical theology, right? There's some way in which our ancestors found in a God that is not all good some sense of being able to understand the universe they were in. Because what you do when you say that God is all good is you make God irrelevant to much of your life, right? Much of your life is actually going to be experiences of suffering, of pain, of loss, of hurt. And if you say God is all good, you banish God from those moments when you are suffering. And now I don't think like our ancient biblical ancestors do today. I was also a student of Neil Gaiman, and there's such a problematic philosophy there. And yet there's something that's actually really powerful about the prophecy of Joel here in his complete embrace of the devastation, the destruction that feels so real right now. You know, every day you pick up the New York Times, and there are people whose livelihoods have been completely stripped of them in an instant. You know, 2 weeks ago they were thriving and they were building and they had hope for the future and they had a plan, and now they are utter devastation and they can see no way to move forward. And Joel's prophecy here, like his articulation of that is so, so real. And there's a temptation to be able to say, yeah, let's make that a metaphor, right? Let's make God's role here a metaphor, because I don't like that, right? But what would it be if we actually went with him, as you're suggesting we could go with him, and say, if God is not just all good, but God is the good and the evil, right? We're not changing to Mechaye, Hakhol, right? We're saying God brings back the Metim, to go back to your previous conversation about resurrection. We're saying God does all these things. It's not just good, it's also bad. Then how could we bring God into this experience we're having now of devastation and move forward with it?
You are bringing God to a human level.
Yeah,
so
right.
Me,
I think that's what the prophet Joel
So
does.
I just want to pivot here for a second, because for me, the God of these prophets is really a turnoff.
Yeah.
I'm out of the game. I'm at the mall, if the malls were open, if this is the God that I have. I just
if you
completely
find one,
reject.
let me know.
Let me just finish.
Yeah.
I want to focus on, I want to take God out of the conversation, because I think the prophetic God is just so not relatable to me. But what I do like is the soul searching that he calls for. And here's my question. Rend your hearts rather than your garments and turn back to the Lord your God. Change your game. What does that say now about, so in other words, we now know that God doesn't send locusts, but climate change sends locusts. If there's a lot of vegetation and a lot of moist and the earth does this and the climate does that, boom, locusts. So science can explain all that, which of course Joel did not know. Here's my question. What does verse 13, rend your hearts rather than your garments, say to us in the season of this pandemic? What is the kind of soul searching that if Joel were here as a 21st century person, he would ask us to be doing now in light of the pandemic?
So I wanted to name, I feel like part of the intensity of the plague of locusts and part of the intensity of the plague that we're facing is a lack of power and a lack of control and an ability to determine what happens. And so both with and I'm sorry to go back to this, I know, but both the conversation about God and the conversation about rend your hearts is about how do you find agency within a situation of powerlessness. And I think for people, it's very important to feel like, bad things are not just random, that there's some explanation, because if I can find the explanation for what is bad, then I can avoid it in the future. And if it's just bad luck, I have no protection. There's just no, like, give me the mask and tell me what, like, the way the contagion works and how long does it last on surfaces. I can protect myself. But if there's no rhyme or reason, then the world is a very scary place. That's A. And then B is in this world of, okay, I found my bit of control, now I can start to do some work. That also has power. And I think sometimes the moments when we're in our darkest places are the moments when we find the most potential for growth, because we're willing to do a lot more than we're willing to do when we're comfortable and safe.
Can I pick up on that sense of agency? Because I actually think that's what the ancient theology gives you. It gives you agency. It gives you a sense that I have a role here and something to do. And in that way, Joel is actually, with his locusts, the most hopeful prophet, because he says you can face locusts. You can see utter devastation and still not be powerless. And you can still see a day when your children will again dream dreams.
Right. So what do we learn from the COVID-19 infestation? If we were to, I mean, Joel is saying to you, if you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got. But if you change up, now if you take a look, so just so that you know, just so we see the end of it, there's this second Tiku Shofar B'Tzion, the second fast. The people fast and they assemble and they pray. Then on bottom of page 5, verse 18, then the Lord was roused on behalf of his land and had compassion upon his people. In response to his people, the Lord declared, I will grant you the new grain, the new wine, and the new oil, and you shall have them in abundance. Nevermore will I let you be a mockery among the nations. I will drive the northerner far from you. What the northerner is, it's phony, is ambiguous, but it likely includes here the locust plague. I will drive the northerner away from you. I'll thrust it into a parched and desolate land. And then, once you've got verse 22, fear not, O beasts of the field, for the pastures in the wilderness are clothed with grass. The trees have borne their fruit. Fig tree and vine have yielded their strength. O children of Zion, be glad. Their nature, their bounty is restored, and with their bounty being restored, their joy is restored, their hope is restored, their life is restored. It ends happily, and then we get the Debbie Friedman song. So, and we don't quite know what they do to change their ways, but we know that they have to change their ways as a result of fasting and assembling. So here's my question. What does this scheme, we suffered, we have to learn, we have to do a soul searching, we have to do things differently to get a better result. What do we learn from COVID-19? What do we as a society have to do differently?
To answer the question you presented before, I was thinking that my mom, going back to my mom and that vivid example, my grandfather was a very devoted religious person. He would go to synagogue every single day. In a way, he was in God's ways, and then all of a sudden he gets locusts. So this prophecy doesn't apply to him at all.
Right.
It doesn't apply to so many people around the world and so many Jewish people who were so devoted, and all of a sudden, horrible things happen to them.
Right. See the Holocaust. That's why that breaks the myth.
Exactly.
But therefore,
we have a problem, and you said it before, but we as people of faith have a problem because we have to deal with these texts all the time.
Right.
And it's hard to find,
so you
associate. I mean, this was written like 3,000 years ago or
Right.
2,500 years ago. And we don't really believe in this.
So that's why we have to interpret and reinterpret, and we have agency in interpreting it. But his basic message that if you do what you always did, you'll get what you always got. If you want a different result, you got to change up your game. That's obviously true then and now. And so again, I want to ask this question too, and get to the emotion. This is the pathos of the prophet. And if you're a parent, you know this pathos. When you're right and they don't listen to you. There's a special kind of hell when you're right and they don't listen to you.
That never happens.
Yeah. And
every day.
And that's right. And that is the pathos of the prophet. The prophet is right and they don't listen. Other than the book of Jonah, which we'll get to, which is really a satire, it's kind of an anti-prophet. 100% of biblical prophets are right and they don't listen and they don't succeed. What are the things what are the things we need to learn from COVID-19, and how can we help get our society to come to grips with that learning?
So it feels to me like part of what's interesting, the interesting tension about Joel is we all know that locusts are natural and have nothing to do with what the people are doing, and that even in the narrative of someday it's just you're magically gonna wake up and God's gonna fix all the things around you and everything's gonna be green again. It's not that like God's like, well, because you said this to your friend, then therefore I will put this leaf on this tree, and because you did this, it's not like that. And so I think what I think Joel exposes is that calamities and plagues offer us the opportunity to open our hearts and to get better, and it's sort of like the world is going to get better on its own and we're going to get better on our own, and those two processes are happening together.
Do you not think, reading this in the lens of Veronica Leifer's, February 2020 testimony, do you not think that even today the deeds that we do regarding climate change make a material difference on this? I mean, the reason that there are still locust plagues in such a degree today, I'm not a scientific expert, but from what I read, has to do with climate change. Is that right?
So it does, but also locusts existed before climate change. So I think it's important, both the frequency and the intensity of the plagues of locusts that we see now are greater because of climate change, but locusts don't exist because of, so I think that's important to piece out. Because yes, there are actions that we can take that impact COVID-19 and its ability to spread. That's true, but it's also true that it wasn't any one person that did something to make COVID-19 happen.
Right.
And can I pick up on that too? Because I think as modern readers, we tend to read this through an individual lens. I mean, Elias, your example about your grandfather, who was a man of faith and did not deserve what was happening to him. And all of those in the Holocaust, right, did not deserve on an individual level. But prophets and the biblical tradition speak not to individuals, they speak to the collective. And I think with that sense of collective, there's a different lens that you can put on here. So I would say, certainly in the era of COVID-19, no one person, did any particular thing that we know of that would have caused this. But as a collective, there are ways that we can protect each other that we're not. I mean, look at the protests even in the United States to say we won't stay home, we won't be part of trying to make our society heal. Right? There are people who say, no, my individual rights are more important than the collective. And the prophetic voice is actually the collective is really critical, because the collective is how we survive and thrive as a human people.
Yeah, Dan.
See, I think Joel has two moves, which I think what all of us are saying, which is the following. He says, for instance, he says the ministers, the priests are going to come forward and say, spare your people, Lord, let not your possessions become a mockery, et cetera, et cetera. Then the Lord was roused on behalf of his land and had compassion. So that's one issue. He's saying that in some ways you have to kind of rely on the leadership. On the other hand, when he says, rend your hearts, it's not only the collective, it's the individual. So when the individual is acting on their own, to rend their own heart, then I think that's, so he's actually really asking for two moves.
Yeah.
But I think with the COVID-19, one of the messages that we can take away is that we can't always rely on our leadership to be always helpful. That we have to rend our hearts individually for the individual actions, the grassroots actions, which will then also.
Let's not talk about politics here.
This is
no, well, I think we do have to. So he says in verse 16, and this is so important. Gather the people, bid the congregation purify themselves, bring together the old, gather the babes and the sucklings at the breast. Let the bridegroom come out of his chamber, the bride from her canopy couch. Mm-hmm. Between the portico and the altar, let the priests and the Lord's ministers weep and say, oh, spare your people. That, in other words, the entire community has to come together.
Right.
And I think, just to name this, I think one of the problems that we have in our country is that the entire American people cannot come together. That's the problem. In other words, like, some obvious learnings from this would be that one does not gut scientific agencies. One does not gut the World Health Organization. One funds science. One puts science at a premium. One puts science ahead of politics. That one exalts expertise. That actually knowing stuff matters. That you don't just make it up from your gut on the day that you happen to be behind the podium. That you actually are guided by science and doctors and health experts. And unfortunately, and one would hope for the entire community to come around those rather unremarkable and non-controversial assertions that when it comes to life and death, science should govern. And we don't have that. We don't have that. And as a result, we can partake of Joel's pathos, which is it's so clear what needs to happen, the primacy of science, the primacy of medicine, the primacy of expertise, putting politics to the side, and the pathos of it all, and that we need a whole country united around those principles, and we don't have that. We have that actually in the Commonwealth. By the way, a number of communities of faith are sending a video to Governor Baker, thanking Governor Baker and his administration for making science the guiding principle here. And we're all doing that tomorrow, our own video saying, Governor Baker, thank you for making science the guiding principle. We don't have that in the country as a whole. See Georgia. So here's my question to you. As you read Joel on week 7 of the lockdown, Joel ends with hope. Right? He goes into great despair, and there's no joy, and there's no food, and there's no livelihood, and there's no economic security, but there's hope at the end. What gives you hope in week 7 of the lockdown?
To me, it's exactly what you said. I mean, it's exactly what you said. I'm lucky enough to be married to a wonderful scientist, Michelle as well. And most of my friends are scientists. I'm the only weirdo. Anyways, but on a serious note, I really trust that we are in such a wonderful state, where science is a priority.
Right.
There are so many brilliant minds around. We are going to see that 4 of the more fabulous scientists in the area are members here. So that's my hope. That's my hope about science and getting a cure for this. But then the remaining question will be, how are we transformed as human beings after this whole experience? Are we going to be better or not?
And what's the answer?
The hope is the same way. That yes.
Yeah.
Michelle,
where's your hope?
We're always reaching for that hope. I, as I've said before, I look to history for hope. And the fact that in 1918, right, more than 100 years ago, the world was utterly destroyed in the way that we're facing today. And 2 years ago, we barely remembered that. A year ago, we barely remembered that. 2 months ago, we barely remembered that. Our world was thriving and growing and beautiful. And I have to believe that we will be able to see that kind of rebirth again. It has happened before in history. And that means, on Joel's point, right? It has happened before, and therefore it can happen again. We can find our way to the other side of this. Of course, it frightens me that we barely remembered it and the lessons of 100 years ago. It frightens me that many of the articles that I've read have said that as soon as the Spanish influenza was over, people just wanted to forget. They just wanted to put it behind them because they weren't proud of who they were. They weren't proud of the society they saw. They were scared of the way in which society had collapsed. And it was better to avoid. It was better to not go there.
Right.
And so I do have concerns that when we emerge on the other end, all of these beautiful learnings that we are coming to about collective responsibility, about social safety nets, about being able to be there for each other, and the acts of mitzvot and heroism that people are doing for each other will likewise be forgotten when we're on the other end, and I hope that doesn't happen.
Elisa, where's your hope? Week 7, through the prism of Joel.
Two places. One, I feel hope in the story of locusts, where it's a plague you have no power to control and no power to solve, and we got through it then, and that gives me hope. And then I think also one of the things that gives me hope, before this plague, we did have in some ways it felt like a more perfect world, but there were still so many people who were struggling, and the income inequality and the gaps between the rich and the poor were growing, and there are so many people in our world who can't work, who this is their life, who are being compromised, and that was their reality before COVID-19, and that is their reality now. And it's only now that we experience what that's like that I think we're developing empathy and compassion and the ability to create structures that will support everyone. So I think that the hope is that through this experience we will be able to build a more compassionate community that can really support all of us, that collective, Michelle, that you were talking about, that the prophetic voice asks us to consider not just our own individual needs.
Actually, so I'm actually not hopeful. I'm not hopeful because I think exactly what Michelle said, learning from history, if Yoel 2,500 years ago or something is giving us a message that is still valid today and that we haven't learned as human beings, I'm not sure that we're ever going to learn. So my feeling is that when this has passed, 7 times 7, however long that's going to be, that we're just going to go back to being who we were, and that once the world gets stronger again, then this will be forgotten. The fact that over 100 years ago, and with the medical and scientific advances that we've made, that we couldn't, in the most scientific country in the world, one of the best places in the world, that we couldn't figure out how to stop this or be better about it is not hopeful for me. This is not hopeful. So that's kind of where I am.
Dan, that is very, you're not hopeful is very helpful. You're not hopeful is very helpful because I think that's where a lot of people really are, as the country just seems to be grappling both with the health and the life assaults and the economic assaults and so much uncertainty, and schools now canceled for the rest of the year, etc. Looks like high holidays for lots of synagogues, including our own, are going to be virtual. As all of this continues kind of indefinitely, I think your not hopeful posture is very real, and it's really good in the week of what would have been the Boston Marathon to see that as Hopkinton. That's kind of our starting point. Not hopeful is our starting point, right? And we have a 26.2 mile race to run now, where we go from not hopeful for a good reason, for all the reasons that you laid out, all the reasons that we all know. How do we get to hope? How do we get to hope? And to me, what's striking about Joel is two things about the end. One is he doesn't actually tell you what they did. I mean, they fast and they assemble, but he doesn't lay out a 3-point plan or a 5-point plan. He just says they kind of looked inward and somehow they changed things up. Okay, and the very fact that the key verse here is that God's compassion was roused. Verse 18. So they all come together. Then the Lord was roused on behalf of his compassion. What's striking, if you study Joel in any depth, is between 17 and 18, verse 17 and 18, when they're all proclaiming and coming together, and 18, then the Lord was roused. Like, what did they do that roused God? And we don't even know. We don't have a 3-point plan, a 5-point plan, a 10-point plan. But we have an impulse towards individuals and the collectivity changing, deepening, getting better. And somehow or another that mobilized God. And so to me, I think not hopeful now means we have work to do to come up with our own change of heart, where individually we think about what can I do differently. And if all of us, by all of us I mean our citizens of this great country, will think, what can I do differently? How can I make a contribution to economic justice, to seeing people that hadn't been seen, to the primacy of science, to the primacy of expertise? Like, if only expertise could be regarded again, to putting politics to the side. If everyone could do that in their own way, then hopefully we have a different result. And the end of it is a multi-generational thing. And here's why I think this is just so, just to end with Joel and end with our song. This is the world that we create. The locust infestation makes clear, and COVID-19 makes clear. The world that we create directly affects your children. Just think about how your kid's school year was canceled out. All their after schools canceled out. That, you know, from March until whenever is a midbar because of the world they inherit, right? So the world that our parents gave us, the world that we give our kids, is all multi-generationally linked. And so we have the greatest incentive to run our 26.2-mile race from not hopeful to hopeful, because literally the futures of our children and grandchildren depend on it. So if you guys would sing the Debbie Friedman song.
So
yes,
as we do.
No, I was going to say that we are so lucky here at Temple Emmanuel. We have so many specialists in different areas, and we have the Debbie Friedman specialist here with us, Michelle Robinson.
So I was actually going to say, Dan, to your point about hopelessness, that Joel is actually one of the most powerful answers to that, and Debbie Friedman brought him to life, this message of the power of actually studying our past in order to make it, so that even no matter how many thousands of years we keep studying, every time we go back to these texts, it asks us to be better. It asks us to continue to remind ourselves that that's the task, no matter how many times we've failed, that we can try to renew it. And the last verse of this Debbie Friedman, today's the day I take my stand, the future's mine to hold, commitments that I make today are dreams from days of old. And that's our charge. I've been singing Debbie Friedman since I was a little kid. My mom was a choir director at our synagogue, and my dad served as the lay cantor and pressed me into service, singing in our synagogue choir. So these words are deeply on my heart, and it's a privilege to sing them now with each of you today. So if you know them, join us. Childhood was for fantasies, for nursery rhymes and toys. The world was much too busy to understand small girls and boys. As I grew up, I came to learn that life was not a game, that heroes were just people that we called another name. And the old shall dream dreams, and the youth shall see visions, and our hope shall rise up to the sky. We must live for today, we must build for tomorrow. Give us time, give us strength, give us life. Now I'm grown, the years have passed, I've come to understand there are choices to be made, and my life's at my command. I cannot have a future till I embrace my past. I promise to pursue the challenge, time is going fast. And the old shall dream dreams, and the youth shall see visions, and our hopes will rise up to the sky. We must live for today, we must build for tomorrow. Give us time, give us strength, give us life. Today's the day I take my stand, the future's mine to hold. Commitments that I make today are dreams of days of old. I have to make the way for generations come and go. I have to teach them what I've learned, so they will come to know that the old shall dream dreams, and the youth shall see visions, and our hope shall rise up to the sky. We must live for today, we must build for tomorrow. Give us time, give us strength, give us life. Give us time, give us strength, give us life. Amen.
Amen.
Shkoyach.
Amen. Thank you. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. See you all in 10 minutes.
And actually, for all of you, I just want to invite you tomorrow, please check your emails tonight. Tomorrow we have, at 9 a.m., an incredible panel of medical experts who are going to be speaking to us about COVID-19 with the Virtual Brotherhood Breakfast. Hope you'll join us there.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.